Hello and welcome to the latest episode of More Than Games Series 2. Last episode we looked at some games that have made their way to the cinema, but now let's look at some films that have made their way to our consoles, starting with the Harry Potter franchise. In 1998, word got round that J.K. Rowling was selling the media rights to the Harry Potter franchise, including the rights to film, TV, and video game adaptations. Various companies were interested, including Disney and Universal, but one of the more interesting companies was Nintendo. As Unseen64 discovered, the moment Nintendo heard about the right being for sale, they immediately halted production on Ridge Racer 64, Bionic Commando, and Crystalis to work on a pitch for Rowling. Nintendo Software Technology, or NST, was the studio tasked with this pitch and was split into two teams. One to work on a pitch for a third-person action-adventure title, and one to work on a prototype game based around Quidditch. NST wished to create these games for Nintendo's 64, Game Boy Advance and GameCube consoles, as well as any other future consoles for Nintendo. These releases would coincide with every book release. Rowling agreed to view Nintendo's pitch, and NST began to divide over disagreements about the game's art style. In the first stages of development, they aimed for an art style based on the original book illustration by Thomas Taylor, but as time went on, Nintendo wanted to take the production elsewhere. Someone close to the production that wishes to remain anonymous told Unseen64, "It went against all my instincts based on what I had read quotes from JK about keeping it strictly British, and I had to revamp my initial designs and go more manga Japanese. I had a big fight about that, but my boss insisted." Unfortunately, Nintendo would not allow any images of this new art direction to be shared publicly. J.K. Rowling ultimately declined Nintendo's pitch as, despite their video game pedigree, these rights were also for film and TV adaptations, which Rowling was not confident Nintendo would put to good use. That's right, if Nintendo had been granted these rights, Harry Potter games would have been first-party Nintendo titles, and we wouldn't have had the 8 fantastic films we got as a result. Anything could have happened. We may not have had any Harry Potter films ever made. Rowling eventually sold the franchise rights to Warner Bros. For a reported £1 million. Warner Bros. Acquired the media rights to Harry Potter and contracted EA to publish the titles. The first, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, based on the book and film of the same name, or Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone if you're in the US. This game was released at the end of 2001 for PC, PlayStation, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. The PC version was developed by Known Wonder as a puzzle platformer, while the PlayStation version was developed by Argonaut here in the UK and is considered more of an action platformer due to its focus on combat as opposed to puzzles. The Game Boy Color version was an RPG designed to play similarly to other turn-based RPGs such as Final Fantasy. This version was developed by Griptonite, as was the Game Boy Advance version. This version of the game was a top-down puzzle title rather than an RPG and featured some smooth pseudo-3D sprites. A whole 2 years later, in December 2003, after the release of the Chamber of Secrets video game, the Philosopher's Stone was remade for the PlayStation 2, Xbox and GameCube. This version follows the events of the film very closely and uses all of the spells and world map from the Chamber of Secrets game. They essentially took the Chamber of Secrets that released a year earlier and reworked it into the Philosopher's Stone story. So the Philosopher's Stone released for PC, PS1, PS2, GameCube, Xbox, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. That is a lot of versions. This was the case for the rest of the original trilogy, with the exception of the lack of a PlayStation and Game Boy Color version of The Prisoner of Azkaban. The Game Boy Advance version of this game took the Game Boy Color's role of becoming an RPG, and a decent one at that. After The Prisoner of Azkaban, the games began to focus more on the story of the films as opposed to the books. This is evident by the box art's sudden switch to art taken directly from the films. We won't be able to cover every game in this episode, but let's take a look at the next trilogy from The Goblet of Fire to The Half-Blood Prince. The Goblet of Fire was a restricted level-based action game, and unfortunately because of this received mixed reviews, but the console and PC versions of the next two games largely continued the sandbox openness of Hogwarts with more action-focused levels and combat mechanics. The portable versions for the DS and Game Boy Advance started to follow the console counterparts with a new focus on action, but from a top-down perspective. The PSP versions, on the other hand, were very similar to their console counterparts, just slimmed down to run on the inferior hardware. But then, of course, news hit that the Deathly Hallows would be adapted into 2 motion pictures to bring all of the book's events to the big screen without cutting huge amounts of content. EA, being EA, took this opportunity to create 2 new Harry Potter games, The Deathly Hallows Parts 1 and 2. EA acknowledged the growing age and maturity of Harry Potter fans and the films themselves, and chose to radically switch up the formula by making third-person shooters. Yep, Harry Potter shooter games. Much like Gears of War and other third-person action games, this game takes place from an over-the-shoulder perspective and replaces guns with wands. It's kind of fun to play for a while, but personally I get rather bored quickly. But from what I understand, there is a community that love this game, especially on the Wii with its motion controls. Unfortunately, with no new books or films on the horizon, there are also no new games currently slated for release. Who knows? Maybe EA will try and cash in on Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, Parts 1 and 2. Or maybe we could start to see some original Harry Potter games developed from the ground up. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you for watching the latest episode of More Than Games Series 2. In the next episode, we will be looking at various other franchises that have made their way from the cinemas onto our consoles. So, until next time!